You'd think the war in Ukraine is about seizing territory, where success is measured in kilometers. The Russian advance in the last 3 years has conquered about a fifth of all of Ukraine. Russia has also lost ground that it would like to get back. But as Russia and the US meet behind closed doors, laying the groundwork for a deal to stop the fighting, Ukraine has been left in the cold.
The US and Russia together on how to end the war in Ukraine, but without Ukraine at the table.
And while we are starting to get a clearer picture of exactly what each side wants out of a resolution, it does go beyond territory. These goals from 3 sides are not compatible, and I'll show you why.
A lot of forks in this game, I'll tell you what. This is a very interesting situation, but the Ukraine war has to end.
Ukraine's future isn't just about land, but land is a starting point, and Ukraine's position is unambiguous.
It's out of constitution to recognize our occupied territory like territory of Russia. We will never do it.
These occupied territories that Ukraine wants back, it's not just about what Russia has captured since the start of the war. It's also about what it captured more than a decade ago. Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014, also Donetsk and Luhansk, which were put under Russian-backed separatist control and which Russia now considers its own territory. Others see it this way too, mainly Russia's allies, like Syria and North Korea. But the overwhelming majority of the world does not recognize the Russian claim to this land. The UN says it was taken illegally. Ukraine wants this land back. But it's worth noting, Volodymyr Zelensky's own 5-point victory plan, published online last October, does not mention reclaiming lost ground at all. What it mentions first, what has been the highest priority for Ukraine, is joining NATO.
And I also will not take NATO membership for Ukraine off the table.
Ukraine has historically seen NATO membership as critical to its survival. It's been seeking the alliance's military protection, the strength of the US and Europe combined, for decades.
The best guarantee for Ukraine from their point of view is NATO membership, so that they get, the nuclear umbrella, they get Article 5, and the Russians probably wouldn't pick a fight with NATO.
But NATO membership is also a red line for Russia.
And this is Putin's point of view. Ukraine is fundamentally a part of Russia. And losing Ukraine to the West is like amputating an arm from Russia. That is a Russian perspective. They perceive this as a deep wound and weakening of Russia's sphere of influence, of what constitutes Russia.
So what Ukraine is really looking for here is some kind of security guarantee, an international force, boots on the ground, a stronger Ukrainian defense, so that Russia, in their view, can't just keep doing what it's doing, invading and seizing territory over and over again, while the world allows it to happen.
Many leaders have talked about Europe that needs its own military, an army of Europe. The armed forces of Europe must be created.
Now, you might have noticed he's talking about the armed forces of Europe, not the US, which might sound strange because the US has been the single largest defense provider to Ukraine since the start of the war. But there is a growing rift between Zelensky and Trump because what Russia wants out of all of this, Trump has so far seemed quite willing to give. Russia wants legitimacy, and it wants in from the diplomatic deep freeze the Biden administration imposed on Russia since the start of the war, where it was sanctioned, cut off financially, and isolated politically.
A dictator!
A murderous dictator. A pure thug.
A brutal tyrant.
All of this is in the process of being reversed.
President Trump has signaled that he wants to bring Putin out of the cold, and he did say specifically that once the war had ended, he saw the United States and Russia cooperating closely again.
We saw glimmers of this new relationship not long ago with a single phone call.
Putin and Donald Trump have had a long phone call.
A 90-minute phone call. Trump reaching out to Putin about ending the war, about geopolitics, world issues, the economy, a shared history, a real camaraderie.
So this is really a sea change in American foreign policy. It's a dramatic development.
This was unnerving to Ukraine because it was neither consulted nor included, simply informed of the call later.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace.
By dealing directly with Russia, with Putin in particular, certainly allowed Putin to have a more prominent role in these negotiations.
And Putin, he wouldn't just get a call. His foreign minister would get an in-person meeting with the US. Once again, Zelensky not invited.
I think he can calculate for himself that he's not going to be getting support from Trump no matter what. So he's got to figure out other ways to get by.
And consider what Trump himself just posted on social media, calling Zelensky a modestly successful comedian engaged in a war that couldn't be won. He slams his poll numbers, says he's played Biden like a fiddle, and levels an incredible accusation with a warning. A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. This is what Putin wants. But it's not the only thing. Russia has explicitly demanded at the UN that it gain permanent control not just of the Ukrainian territory it has managed to capture to date, but also the entire Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, even the parts Russia hasn't yet captured. But experts say, don't make the mistake of thinking this is simply about land.
Russia is comfortably the largest country in the world already. The area of Ukraine that Russia currently occupies would add 0.7% to Russia's total existing landmass. It's not about territory. Putin ultimately wants the United States to withdraw from Europe and for European security to be reordered on Russian terms.
And Russian terms have so far been strict. From this proposal in 2022, demilitarize Ukraine, limit their total troop count to no more than 50,000, that's a sliver of what it had been before the war, bar Ukraine from developing long-range missiles, and abandon any prospect of Ukraine joining NATO.
So that it would be unable to defend itself effectively against a further assault by Russia.
But there's at least one other consideration that might underpin not just what Russia wants, but why it wants it now.
The Russians are currently burning the wick at both ends, and their current rates of advance are actually not sustainable at the current tempo.
Yes, Putin might be looking for an exit strategy. Military spending now consumes about 1/3 of Russia's overall budget. Just for context, almost no other country spends that much of their money on defense.
People started to notice that because of the war, which requires more and more resources, human and financial, parts of Russian life become underfinanced. I mean, infrastructure, utilities infrastructure, and so on and so forth.
Add to that sanctions from the West, which have isolated and restricted Russia's economy, sending the value of the Russian ruble to new lows, which in turn, if you're a Russian, has made everything imported more expensive, which further drives up prices.
The Russian economy is running extremely hot. Vladimir Putin mentioned in October that Russia needs another 1 million workers. Now, where will it find those? Who knows?
Russia started sending thousands of inexperienced troops to what soldiers themselves call the meat grinder.
This is why it has turned to North Korea for support, replacing spent munitions and soldiers.
Putin relied heavily on tapping Russia's prison population in 2023. That prison population it no longer exists anymore.
But these may all be temporary problems, because what Putin seems to have found in Trump is a willing partner whose overarching interest lines up pretty well with Russia's. Donald Trump has been quite consistent, even before the start of his second term, that his objective is simply to end the war.
I would get a settlement in 24 hours. I want everybody to stop dying. They're dying, Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying. And I'll have that done. I'll have that done in 24 hours.
But peace is only part of the reason. Under the Biden administration, the U.S. sent more than $100 billion worth of aid, money, and military assets to Ukraine. This is less than what Europe as a whole has contributed, but more than any other single country. And Trump has long wanted to scale back American involvement in the war. It's also becoming clear that he assigns some of the blame to Zelensky, the leader of the invaded country, for not ending the war sooner.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine.
Now, when it comes to what the U.S. wants to see in any deal, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, has already laid out some constraints.
We must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
These three things line up almost exactly with what Putin has long demanded: that Russia can keep at least some of the Ukrainian territory it has captured, that Ukraine should not immediately be made part of NATO, and that the U.S. doesn't see any of this as a war it should have to fight. That's Europe's job.
Trump has been clear he wants to do, and hopefully ultimately is guaranteed by strength of Europeans who are there prepared to back it up.
But there is another factor at play, and that's wealth.
We're putting in hundreds of billions of dollars. They have great rare earth, and I want security of the rare earth.
Trump believes that Ukraine in some way owes the United States, either for its help to date or for future aid. When Trump says Ukraine has great rare earths, what he's referring to is an abundance of critical minerals buried deep within Ukrainian soil.
These minerals are incredibly strategically important, especially for the development of green technologies.
You can find examples of these minerals all over the periodic table. Things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, copper, titanium, phosphorus, and then basically this whole row of lanthanides.
You'll see the same minerals in things like flat screen TVs, you'll see them in cell phones, and you'll also see them in a lot of military applications, guidance systems, sensors and tracking systems and so on. These are important minerals for the future.
I should say, Zelensky's own victory plan does suggest Ukraine could be open for investment. It mentions strategic economic potential, critical resources, and joint investment and use of this economic potential. But so far, whatever Trump's version of that economic potential looks like, Zelensky has shut down, calling Trump's proposals of giving back in minerals not a serious conversation. Bottom line, the war in Ukraine is complicated and always in flux. Zelensky was once heralded as a hero in Congress, but now reduced to spectating a negotiation he wasn't invited to. Putin, meanwhile, has gone from international pariah, facing thousands of international sanctions and an international warrant for his arrest, to now having the ear of the most powerful world leader on the planet. And Trump, he wants to be the one to make the deal.